Imagine a television show so powerful, so uncomfortably honest, that one of its own episodes had to be erased from existence. Not because it was poorly made, not because audiences didn't understand it, but because they understood it too well. Picture a story that aired once in the spring of 1964 and then vanished. No reruns, no home video release, no streaming, just silence. For 55 years this episode existed in whispers, passed around on grainy bootleg tapes, debated in fan forums, and quietly omitted from every official collection of one of the greatest television series ever made. The show was The Twilight Zone. The episode was called The Encounter, and what happened to it is a story about censorship, about war, about racial guilt, and about the stories a nation chooses to forget when remembering becomes too painful. To understand why The Encounter was buried, you have to understand the world that created it, and the man who refused to look away from that world. Rod Serling was not your typical television writer. He was a World War II paratrooper who had served in the Pacific Theater, witnessed combat, and come home carrying something heavy that never quite left him. That weight showed up in everything he wrote. He believed storytelling had a moral obligation. It wasn't enough to entertain. A story had to mean something. It had to shake you loose from your comfortable assumptions and drop you somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere you had to think your way out of. The Twilight Zone premiered on CBS on October 2, 1959, and it was unlike anything American television had seen. Instead of a recurring cast or a single continuous narrative, it was an anthology, a different story every week, a different set of characters, a different moral puzzle to sit with. What tied it all together was Serling's narration, that calm, deliberate voice that always seemed to know more than it was letting on. He was the guide into darkness, the quiet warning before the descent. What made Serling genuinely remarkable wasn't just his talent, it was his strategy. He had learned, the hard way, that the television industry in 1950s and 1960s America was not interested in difficult conversations. Sponsors controlled the content. Network executives feared controversy. Southern broadcasting affiliates threatened to pull support the moment a show touched anything resembling racial politics. Serling had experienced this directly when an early teleplay he wrote about the murder of Emmett Till was so heavily censored by the network that it became meaningless. The victim's race was changed, the location was shifted, and the entire moral point was gutted. So Serling adapted. If you wanted to talk about racism, you set the story on another planet. If you wanted to critique authoritarianism, you made the villain a robot or an alien. You wrapped the truth in science fiction because science fiction slipped past the gatekeepers. Sponsors didn't panic when the story was set in the distant future. Executives didn't flinch when the tyrant was a creature from another dimension. But the message got through. The audience understood. That was the genius of The Twilight Zone. It was subversive by design, political by necessity, and honest by disguise. For 5 seasons, this approach worked most of the time. Episodes tackled nuclear paranoia, mob mentality, xenophobia, and the seductive comfort of conformity. They were brilliant, and they were just oblique enough to survive. But then came an episode that couldn't hide behind metaphor. An episode that looked directly at one of America's most shameful wartime chapters and refused to blink. And that episode broke the unspoken agreement between Serling and the system that tolerated him. The Encounter aired on May 1, 1964, during the 5th and final season of The Twilight Zone. On the surface, it was a simple production, what the industry calls a bottle episode, meaning the entire story takes place in a single location with a minimal cast. No elaborate sets, no special effects, just 2 men, 1 attic, and about 25 minutes of slow-building psychological tension that, by the end, feels like a pressure cooker that has finally given way. The first character is Fenton, a white World War II veteran played by Neville Brand. He is cleaning out his attic when the story begins, sorting through decades of accumulated junk, including a Japanese samurai sword, a war trophy he took from a soldier he killed in the Pacific. The second character is Arthur Takamori, a young Japanese-American man played by George Takei, who knocks on the door looking for yard work. Fenton invites him up, offers him a beer, and what begins as casual conversation between strangers slowly transforms into something far darker and more psychologically complex. As the two men talk, the layers begin to peel back. Fenton's war stories grow increasingly disturbing. He admits to killing a Japanese soldier who may not have been armed. He describes taking the sword almost casually, as though looting a body was simply part of what war meant. Arthur, meanwhile, grows strange and agitated. He seems drawn to the sword in a way he cannot explain, and then he reveals something that changes the entire atmosphere of the scene. He tells Fenton that his father was a spy for Imperial Japan, that his father had provided information that contributed to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The moment that confession lands, the episode shifts into something almost unbearable to watch. Both men are now exposed. Fenton carries the guilt of what he did in combat, the possible murder of a defenseless man, the theft of a trophy from the dead. Arthur carries a different kind of inherited shame, the suggestion that his own blood was complicit in one of the most devastating attacks in American history. Neither man is innocent, neither man is entirely guilty, and neither man can leave the room, not physically and not emotionally. The ending is violent, it is unresolved, and it offers no comfort whatsoever. The reaction from viewers was immediate and intense. CBS was flooded with complaints. Asian American community groups objected to the portrayal of Arthur's father as a traitor, arguing that the storyline reinforced dangerous stereotypes at a time when Japanese Americans were still living with the wounds of wartime internment. Other viewers called the episode anti-American. Some found it simply too bleak, too raw, too devoid of the moral resolution television was supposed to provide. Sponsors grew nervous. Network executives, already anxious about the show's declining ratings and rising production costs, made a quiet decision. The Encounter was pulled from syndication. When the show entered its long second life through reruns, cable, home video, and eventually streaming, that episode was simply not there. What makes The Encounter so much more than a controversial piece of television is what it was actually speaking to, a chapter of American history that, in 1964, the country was still actively refusing to acknowledge. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States government issued Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced removal of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from their homes along the West Coast. The vast majority of these individuals were American citizens. They had been born in the United States, raised in American schools, built businesses and families and communities here. None of them had been charged with a crime. None of them were given a trial. They were relocated to internment camps scattered across remote, harsh terrain, places like Manzanar in California, Hart Mountain in Wyoming, and the Rower Relocation Center in Arkansas, based on nothing more than their ethnicity. The government justified the internment on grounds of national security, claiming it could not distinguish loyal Japanese Americans from potential saboteurs. But no such saboteurs were ever found. No mass acts of espionage by Japanese Americans were ever documented. The internment was not a security measure. It was an act of racial hysteria, driven by fear, political pressure, and deeply rooted prejudice that had existed on the West Coast for decades before the war ever began. George Takei, who played Arthur in The Encounter, had lived this history in his own body. He was 5 years old when soldiers came to his family's home in Los Angeles and ordered them to leave. His family was sent to the Rower camp in Arkansas, where they remained for the duration of the war. He remembered, decades later, the image of armed soldiers standing guard over children. He remembered his parents trying to protect him from the full weight of what was happening. He remembered the confusion of being told that the country you were born in had decided you were its enemy. That biographical reality makes Takei's casting in The Encounter one of the most quietly devastating creative decisions in the history of American television. Here was a man who had been interned as a child, playing a character whose own sense of identity and worth had been shattered by that same history. When Arthur says his father was a spy, when he internalizes the very stereotypes that had been used to justify locking his people away, Takei is not just acting. He is performing a kind of cultural wound that the show barely had the language to describe. Rod Serling understood that the internment was one of the most glaring examples of the gap between America's stated values and its actual behavior. He understood that the country was not yet ready to reckon with it honestly, and so he did what he always did. He built a room where two people had to sit with the truth until one of them broke. 55 years is a long time for a story to wait, but stories, particularly honest ones, have a way of outlasting the systems that suppress them. The Encounter returned to public view in 2016 when it was included in a full Twilight Zone marathon broadcast, unedited and without apology. The response from audiences confirmed what Serling had known all along. The episode had not aged into irrelevance. It had aged into urgency. The tensions it dramatizes are not relics of a distant past. Anti-Asian racism in the United States did not end when the internment camps closed. It persisted through decades of legislation, labor discrimination, and cultural marginalization, and it surged again with vicious force during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Asian Americans were blamed, harassed, and physically attacked in cities across the country. Elderly people were shoved on sidewalks. Women were assaulted on subway platforms. Children were bullied in schools. The language of contamination and foreign threat, language that echoes directly through the history of the internment, returned with troubling ease. In that climate, the dynamic between Fenton and Arthur in that attic feels less like period drama and more like a diagnosis. Fenton's paranoia, his inability to see Arthur as simply a man, his reflexive suspicion rooted in wartime trauma and racial conditioning, mirrors a pattern that repeats itself across American history with numbing consistency. And Arthur's internalized shame, the way he seems almost compelled to accept the worst version of his own story, reflects something that psychologists and historians have documented extensively: the damage that systemic racism does not just to communities but to the individuals within them, who sometimes absorb the contempt directed at them until it becomes indistinguishable from self-perception. Serling never gave his audience an escape hatch. That was the point. He didn't allow viewers to feel superior to either character, because neither character was simply wrong or simply right. Both men were products of a world that had made violence ordinary and guilt unspeakable. The sword in the attic wasn't just a prop. It was the story of what gets passed down when a nation refuses to account for what it has done, the damage that doesn't disappear just because nobody talks about it, the wound that keeps reopening in new forms across new generations. The United States government formally apologized for the Japanese-American internment in 1988 through the Civil Liberties Act signed by President Ronald Reagan. Survivors received symbolic financial reparations. The official record was corrected. But a formal apology, however meaningful, cannot undo the lived experience of those 120,000 people. It cannot return the homes, the businesses, the years, and it cannot prevent the same logic, the logic that says fear justifies the suspension of rights when the target looks foreign enough, from being applied again. That is why the Encounter matters now, not as a historical artifact to be admired from a safe distance, but as a warning that is still in effect. It matters because the instinct to suppress uncomfortable stories has not gone away. It has simply found new forms: content moderation algorithms, platform policies, the quiet editorial decisions about which voices get amplified and which ones get buried. The specific mechanisms have changed. The underlying dynamic has not. Rod Serling spent his career fighting for the right to tell stories that made people uncomfortable. He believed, deeply and without apology, that discomfort was not a flaw in storytelling, it was the point. A story that leaves you exactly as you were when you sat down has failed at its most essential task. The Twilight Zone, at its best, did not let you sit still. It got under your skin and stayed there. The Encounter is, in that sense, the purest expression of everything Serling was trying to do. It is a story about guilt and inheritance, about war and what it costs the people who survive it, about a country that built its identity on ideals it could not always live up to, and about two men who could not escape the history that had made them. It was banned because it was too honest. It is back now because honesty, however delayed, has a way of returning.